Show is brought to you by DeMarcus Cousins turnovers, almost as good as an assist for the other team. Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. We're just coming down to the wire for the regular season, and that's what we'll be talking tonight. I'm your host, Andres Alvarez, who you can find on Twitter as Nerd Numbers. Hopefully, we'll have a special guest appearance by Patrick Minton, who has been keeping you up to date on everything he thought was going to come true in the preseason. He actually put his money where his mouth is, and we'll see how much of that is coming true. If you've been following the blog for the last week, hopefully you've been keeping up. As always, this show is produced by the wonderful, the fantastic, the magnificent Brian Foster, who you can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. I believe you are both on camera today, Brian, and have something to say. If you don't hear anything, it means Brian forgot to unmute himself. And if that happens, like it did last week, mock him relentlessly in the comments. I know I say not to do that. I'll let this one slide. What's up, Brian?
So you're mocking here live on air isn't enough? We need it in the comments as well. I think you're right. We got to teach me a lesson here. But go ahead, Jay.
I was going to say, actually, it was funny last week on the comments. I consider this fighting dirty, but, it's our show, so whatever. We talked racism, which I think was kind of off the cuff. I didn't really expect to be talking as much as I did. And I basically said at the end, I was like, just be aware this is a touchy subject for me. So, please don't come into the comments with kind of an entitled white privilege thing. And someone hopped in and I deleted their comment. And then they hopped in again and said, oh, you're scared of criticism, so you deleted my comment, which, by the way, I may bring this up. I may put this in the links, but I wrote a post up on what I do for moderating comments. And one of the kind of hot button things for me is like, don't complain about me knocking your comment off. So that was funny. That's like 2 strikeouts in a row, in my opinion. I thought it was amusing. So sorry, I cut you off. What were you saying, Brian?
No, I got nothing. Let's start the show.
All right, so pretty much this week we've only got 2 things going, and these are big ones. What we're going to talk first is kind of the playoff landscape, some thoughts we have about the playoffs, kind of how we think things will shake out, Sorry about that. How we think things will shake out. And then, of course, we want to have Patrick on the show. He has to run a quick errand, so hopefully he'll be able to arrive by the time we're done talking about the playoff status, and we'll actually be able to hear him talk about kind of his preseason bets, what went wrong, why maybe you should do a Vanguard account instead of betting on the NBA, even though the NBA is one of the most consistent and reliable sports. Yeah, that's what we're going to go for. All right, so playoff picture. So, Brian, I'll actually give you the intro if you want it here. If you're looking down kind of how everything's looking in not even just the West, in the playoffs in general, there's one team that stands head and shoulders above everybody else. I'm actually really curious on your thoughts about the Golden State Warriors and how they look going into the playoffs.
They look great. I mean, the conversation around them right now is how great of an all-time great team are they going to be in terms of point margin. They've been up around 10 points point margin per game, I think, all season. And, I mean, that's all we're going for right now. And so I guess it's not quite as bad as Kentucky going into the NCAA tournament. They're going to be the favorite, maybe not the 30% favorite or whatever Kentucky was. But, yeah, I mean, they got a pretty good chance of winning it all.
Yeah, and apologies if you hear me clicking in the background. I have a quieter mouse, but, if you can still hear it. I'm actually trying to look up, what Brian was just saying, because basically their simple rating system on Basketball Reference is currently at 10.1. And I am really, really, really curious how many teams in NBA history have finished, above 10. So I'm trying to very subtly do that while we're talking. Probably not a good thing to do on not a lot of sleep, but let's give it a try. All right, above 10, there have only been, Brian, I hate to steal your role tonight. There have only been 7 teams in the history of the NBA with a simple rating score above 10. Currently, the Golden State Warriors are it, and the last team to do it is the 1996-1997 Chicago Bulls. Now, here's what I should stress for those of you that don't know. In 1995, the NBA decided to shorten the three-point line. And this, actually, I will talk a little bit about this. We talked a little bit about Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman last show. The simple fact of the matter is a lot of the reason that Michael Jordan, is considered the greatest player of all time is a bunch of really weird circumstances that kind of happened together. And ironically, part of it did include him retiring from basketball after his father's death to go play baseball. As when Michael Jordan retired, the Bulls didn't know what was going on, despite the fact that they made the playoffs the next season with like 55 to 57 wins, I forget what. They didn't, go as far. So Horace Grant decided to hop ship and go play with Shaq. As a result, the Bulls basically were left with just Pippen. All of the Bulls that had been part of the team that had been on the first three-peat disappeared. Scottie Pippen, stayed firm, but the Bulls needed to rebuild, and part of rebuilding involved picking up Dennis Rodman essentially off waivers. The San Antonio Spurs. This is an interesting case in professional sports where a player can be super talented, but just not agreeing with the front office can get them banned. This is sports is interesting to me, but basically they had to pick Dennis Rodman off of waivers. In his autobiography, Phil Jackson basically said he had a list of 10 power forwards he wanted on the Bulls. Dennis Rodman was 10th, but the Spurs were so mad at him that basically he had to act quick if he wanted to grab him. So he basically grabs Dennis Rodman really quickly. Michael Jordan comes back from retirement. Pippen resigns. The NBA at the same time shortens the 3-point line, and this came together to make one of the greatest Bulls teams ever, one of the greatest teams in NBA history ever. So the comparison I'll give you here is Steph Curry is essentially a cheat code. Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green are essentially like when the NBA was playing with a shortened 3-point line. So that's how good they're playing. They're playing like a team in the past that had a 3-point line, I believe, 2 to 3 feet shorter than it is now, which I think that's just absurd.
It is absurd. I know the other thing we talk about with Curry and his shooting is how he kind of breaks the rules in terms of catch and shooting versus off the dribble, right? He can pull up and take contested threes off the dribble. Like,
well, that's what we argue. It's they look contested.
Exactly.
And I love this metaphor. I'll probably just I'll use this on every show from here on out until the Warriors win a title or get knocked out of the playoffs. But I consider Steph Curry to be the Ricky Henderson of basketball, in the sense that one of the famous quotes, I believe it's Bill James, if not, it was said about Ricky Henderson, is that he was just so fast from first to second that they were able to, you could time a pitcher to catcher to second base time. And if it took them more than 2.2 seconds, they had no hope of catching Ricky Henderson. Now, if you were watching that game, notice we said 2.2 seconds. Well, if you got the ball to the bag in 2.5 seconds, it would look really close, right? It would look as if you almost caught him. But the simple fact of the matter is there was nowhere close. The base coach could have told Ricky Henderson, look, if I think he's going to throw a fastball and he can't see you, just go. There, you don't even need to, you're going to do it no matter what. And I think Steph Curry is the same way, where we watch the game and to us it appears like the defender almost got there in time. But to Steph Curry, it was like there was no one there at all by the time the ball left his hand is when he first saw the defender get in his face.
No, he's having an amazing season for sure. He started out a little bit slower with his shooting, but then as the season has gone on, he's brought it up. And maybe I'll bring up his numbers on Boxscore Geeks and we can just kind of look at him a little bit. But
all right,
man, is he having a great year.
I'm looking at them right now too. Now, here's my question to you. This should be an easy one. Who's the MVP this season in your mind?
Ooh, I haven't looked in a little bit. So I think he's going to win it for sure. But should he actually be the MVP? The weird thing is, so Harden is the guy that everyone's saying it's going to be him or Harden, right? Then, of course, what we always say is, well, don't discount Paul and Jordan. Neither of them will win it.
Jordan, obviously.
That's right, yeah, not Michael Jordan, but maybe he could win another one. Who knows? But yeah, neither of them will win it because, well, Jordan #1 doesn't score enough points, but they're also on the same team as each other, so they're gonna steal votes.
They're not a top 4 seed. That does really hurt.
That's true. But those two guys are almost literally carrying the whole team by themselves, which is pretty impressive. They're, I believe, the two most wins produced now are those two guys over Curry and Harden.
But, yeah, which is I'm looking at that right now. It looks like Curry's got the best per minute stats right now. The only reason he's below the others is because he's 2 games fewer. I think James Harden is definitely impressive. I just don't think he's at the same. Those other 3, I don't think it's the same level. But I was tweeting about this week, and something to consider about the MVP. All right, is if you look at Boxscore Geeks, right, we can show all the players on one page. And so here's just an interesting question I have, which I haven't asked before, so apologies while I'm stalling for it to come up, is that if we look at all of the players in the NBA with like above, 10 wins or whatever, it's a decent number. And while I do think that there are definitely different stratas of players, this was my argument for the MVP in general, which is to say a player just has to be good enough to a player just has to be good enough to beat a threshold for me to be considered an MVP. And then after that, whatever you want to say, right? You can say DeAndre Jordan deserves the MVP because stats matter. And all of you people that come to me on Twitter and say that I don't know what I'm talking about, you don't know what you're talking about. I know that sounds childish, as I was telling Brian pre-show. I haven't had a lot of sleep. And frankly, I've studied enough higher level math that when people lecture me on how I don't understand math, I just kind of go, whatever. All right, so you could say that for DeAndre Jordan. You could say Chris Paul deserves it because he's effing Chris Paul, and oh my goodness, if he doesn't get an MVP in his prime, they need to just give him a lifetime achievement because he's probably the best. Him and Stockton are the two greatest players in NBA history to not get an MVP at this point. Jason Kidd's close. Do you want to say James Harden? Because James Harden, I mean, again, you don't need to do much for me. You just need to not pick a terrible name. And so there are lots of really good names, but I think the MVP award is stupid because we have 30 teams. We have, we have 30 teams. We have five different starting positions, and you can combine some of them. In theory, you could say maybe three, right? You could do the MVP, not MVP, the All-Star game trick of guards, forwards, center, or, a point guard, some wings, some bigs, whatever. The simple fact of the matter is, even baseball, I always come back to baseball. Baseball at least goes different conferences, right? The AL, the American leagues, I guess. The American League and the National League. Well, there's something to be said there. Curious question, Brian, just throwing this out to you while I'm stalling. What are
Ooh,
your
a
thoughts on
sidetrack.
what are your thoughts on the designated hitter?
I mean, I grew up watching National League baseball, so I don't care for it very much, but I understand why it exists. I think it's the reason why we like watching the pitchers hit is more Schadenfreude than anything. Kind of like why we like watching golf. We like to see professionals do really poorly, even though they're the best in the world. So maybe that's why we like the National League.
You are a
But
sick man, Brian.
at the same time, okay, I'll give a more legitimate answer though. I do like watching the hitting pitchers do well. Like what's his name, Mike Hampton, a few 10 years ago or so, hit all those home runs in Colorado. Like guys like that are fun to watch. Levon Hernandez.
Fair enough. But what I will say is, in baseball you have, you basically give the MVP for the pitchers each year and you give it to each league. And you have the MVP for basically the batters and you give it to each league. And so, baseball has, basically four MVP awards you could consider. And, basketball, there's no reason to think you couldn't basically even just do basically guards and bigs and then do each conference. We're going to talk a little bit about in playoffs the conference disparity, but it was kind of the same argument I had with Dikembe Mutombo or defensive stats. It's if you want me to believe that you actually believe in this system, this process, in this case, the conferences, then you actually have to put your money where your mouth is. So it's the same with Dikembe Mutombo. If you want me to actually believe you care about defense and a player who has four defensive players of the year, the first player to ever do it, who, had like the blocking title multiple years, who, was all defense, who was an all-star. Like if you want me to actually believe that you think defense matters, then you better damn sure put him first ballot Hall of Fame or just tell me you're lying. And it's kind of the same with the conferences. Like if you want me to believe that you think we should have two conferences, then give each of them an MVP. Like there's no reason not to. I actually say basketball needs to steal more random stuff from baseball, and ironically, baseball needs to steal more random stuff from basketball. I think between the two sets of kind of arbitrary, trivial rules that don't make a lot of sense, there's a good set of decent rules between the two. But on their own, they're maddening. Both sports, I would say.
Well, I agree with that last point. One thing baseball has always done well for a long time is they have a ton of off-season awards, right? They have all these like Golden Gloves and all this other crap. I guess NBA has all defensive team, and
Let's
they
just
mostly
be
have the
clear,
same
and like I
analogs.
said, all defense and defensive player of the year mean nothing. Let's just
Yeah.
let's just I mean, even if they mean something, like it's pennies on the dollar, maybe nickels or dimes on the dollar to the other awards. They have the all NBA. They have the MVP, the all NBA, the rookie of the year, I guess the sixth man of the year, which is a really stupid award to be candid. You know, I would be okay with like, more, like you said, like Golden Gloves, by conference,
Mm.
by division, whatever. And then if you get people complaining like they already do that, hey, you can't give an MVP to the East versus the West because of this, then it's like then maybe you should restructure, do something else, or do
Now,
relegation. Someone said that in the comments, which I really enjoyed.
when you say they don't matter, you mean for individual player salary, right? If you win an MVP, it'll help your profile, but then getting a defensive player of the year award won't help you get paid as much.
I don't think it has the same clout, and I don't think people genuinely care. And the other problem with some of like the Defensive Player of the Year awards is like, first off, the NBA is very nebulous in what it gives out awards for. Now, to be fair, baseball has the same issue. Like basically, Derek Jeter and Kobe Bryant are perfect analogs, to be candid. Where like Derek Jeter was getting Golden Gloves and Kobe Bryant was getting all defense, and neither was correct. Um, but yeah, basically the defensive awards just are not given the same clout as the offensive ones, and that's just kind of how it goes. And like I said last week's show, there was kind of a cultural shift in the mind when you gave the voting privileges to the writers who really only had at the time access to lists of points per games. Like that's, I think what's interesting is because we always come back to the yay points, thesis that Dave Barry basically talked about in Wages of Wins and Ethan Sherwood Strauss named, which is points dictate who gets paid, who gets awards, who gets everything in the NBA. And what's worth considering is that there was a stretch of time when the people that were reporting on the sport and voting on the accolades, that's all they had. They had a sheet of paper that said, here's how many points all the players scored in each game. And then if they fouled out.
Yeah,
So
and we did
it's,
show one of those old box scores on air last week. That was really fun.
yeah. And I love when Basketball Reference put those up because it's interesting when you say that we only use these metrics. And I've seen this happen a lot. And I've even seen this happen with smart people. It really drives me mad. But, and I'm even going to be, I'm going to throw kind of us under the bus, even the Wages of Wins, Boxscore Geeks crew. I've seen analysts of ours basically say, I use this stat because I don't have the stat I want. I use defensive win shares because at this point I don't have years enough of data to do the proper kind of defense thing. And it's kind of like, it's easy and tempting to do, especially when, for instance, you're doing this for free. A lot of basketball stats bloggers do this for free. But
Not for free. We actually pay money for hosting and software and all that. So we're in the negative doing this show and the website.
that's totally true. Yeah, I pay. Yeah, Patrick pays for hosting for this. I pay for premium hosting for Libsyn so that you guys can get it quick and easy, and I don't have to write RSS and all that. Oh, that's good,
We
Brian.
pay good money to force you guys to watch this stuff.
And then I get a bunch of Twitter followers and I spam about it on tweet. God, you're right. But no, I mean, it's not hard to believe that people in the absence of good data will just use the data they have. And it's really, when it's their job, I think we've talked about this before, when it's your job to write about sports, it is not really tenable to come to your boss and say, I don't have the data required to do the proper story here, so I'm not going to write about James Harden. Your boss is just going to say, James Harden is an MVP candidate right now. He just scored 35 points last night or whatever. You have to write about him. I don't care what you write. Go find something. And that's when you go to ESPN and you find this RPM stat or per or whatever, and you use that. And I'm saying I've seen people at Sloan. I basically, my first year at Sloan, I asked a few presenters some questions. And I basically said that. I said, man, I'm really loving the tangents, Brian. And I'm going to be candid too. I'm probably not even going to do that extensive of show notes because I'm really tired and I'm going to go to sleep after the show. This is going to be a fantastic show for the viewers. But okay.
Especially
So,
if you fell asleep on air. That would be pretty
yeah,
exciting.
I should.
No,
Well,
continue.
If Patrick shows up. Okay, so one article I should write, and if I don't, lucky you, you get to hear me rant about it on air right now, is that many people are not very good at doing regression analysis. A regression saddens my heart. I really like Ian Levy. He does a lot of good stuff, and Nylon Calculus has some good stuff, but there is hit and miss in it. And they have a metric called DRE, whatever, and it's a regression on RPM. And I've seen a few people start doing regressions on RPM. Now, the issue is if you regress box score data onto a statistic like RPM or RAPM. And so, by the way, Dre at Nylon Calculus has this, and BPM at Basketball Reference do this. If you do not include the other data that allegedly RPM handles, which would be teammate interaction and strength of schedule and whatever, then your regression is misspecified because the way regressions work is the phrase you should get used to if you think about regressions is everything else being equal. So like Brian, you and I, if we go into a casino, it's like saying Brian wins $10 compared to Andres's $2 every time Brian bets on seven. Well, that might be true, but what we actually have to kind of adjust for is what were the circumstances where Dre bets on seven versus Brian betting on seven? So Brian might bet on seven when Brian is showing a four as his whole card. I'm talking blackjack here, has 4-7. Of course, you're going to hit that. I might not hit on seven because I have 10 as my whole card and you're supposed to stay there. And then the dealer's got an edge. So the key to regression analysis is you look at all the data and you basically say, for instance, we've seen people say, we've seen smart people say offensive rebounds seem to not matter. It seems like they're stealing from the team, blah, 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 blah. And what you have to ask is everything else being equal, if we hold missed shots consistent, if we hold number of shots consistent, if we hold number of assists consistent, what does an offensive rebound do for a team? And many people don't do this analysis. It's not easy analysis to do. It's also really easy to forget variables when you're doing regression, to leave stuff out. But a lot of people do that. And so the issue we kind of run into with a lot of the analysis of players is people make their own metrics that are basically misspecified and bad. They don't understand the reason why other people use them. It's kind of a weird self-perpetuating prophecy of self-perpetuating. That's not the self-fulfilling. I guess both work though. A self-perpetuating, philosophy. I'm going to use that, Brian. I'm just going to say self-perpetuating philosophy of bad stats leading to bad kind of meta-analysis from analysts, leading to just the same thinking pervasive, existing. And we've basically seen that going all the way back to the original point when points per game became the de facto stat that writers had to use to vote on players. That's basically controlled the analysis of sports and basketball for the last 30 years, that's really fascinating to view, but it's also a little disheartening for people that think DeAndre Jordan deserves MVP consideration. Though thankfully our own numbers say that Chris Paul is slightly better now. So I guess if you only had one MVP to give out, I would give it to Chris Paul, I guess.
I can get on board with Chris Paul for sure. What I've got up on screen right now we already talked about, right? All four of these guys are amazing. What I've got up on screen right now is sorted by points over par with the 500-minute floor. So you get guys like Durant, Gobert, Whiteside, even Jimmy Butler. Well, he ended up with a lot of minutes before he got hurt, and he's back now, I think. But you get the point. Like, the lower minute guys get involved now. Despite all that, as the people who are watching on video can see, Curry is the highest points over par out of all those guys. So maybe Curry does deserve it after all. He just hasn't played.
Again, all of them are above 8 points.
Oh,
this
yeah.
I've talked this before, like when we talked Steve Nash, I brought this up, which is when we start analyzing really great players next to each other, we get into these numbers that are essentially indistinguishable. I'm stealing a story from the Wages of Wins about two hitters, I forget who. But like a 343 hitter versus a 350 hitter, that's 7 hits in 1,000 at bats. And to be fair, a batter on a good day, and that's if the team is getting lots of hits, will get 5 at bats. So it means it would take you 2 games, and that's if they got all of those 7 hits in 2 games, which batters don't, right? A good batter is going to hit once or twice a game on a normal game. So we have 8.7 for Stephen Curry, points over par for 48. Okay, versus James Harden, he's down there. 7. So this sounds like a big difference, right? 7 points over par for 48.
Oh, it looks like we've... there we go. You're back, Dre. We had a little stall there. Keep going.
What was the last thing I said?
You were just on points over par of 8 or more a game. Yeah.
Yeah, and all I'm saying is...
We got it all in.
Even if you look at James Harden versus Steph Curry, it's only 1.6 points over par for 48. That means if you watch the entire game of basketball, essentially that would boil down to less than 1 2-pointer. Now, of course, there are other stats, right? Rebounds, assists, steals, turnovers, personal fouls, etc., that impact that. But that's what I'm saying is if you were to have a game of both players playing right next to each other, and they both played the exact same number of minutes and both had an average, I'll put that in quote, game for themselves, you would be, if you blinked when James Harden made a mid-range two, or blinked when Steph Curry passed the ball, you would miss the difference between those two players and they would look indistinguishable from each other. So that's kind of the issue when you start getting into advanced stats. And again, that's my whole justification for just having a threshold. And it's also the same justification for if you're a team constructing a front office constructing a team. I am very tired, by the way, just so you're aware. I'm not drunk on air, which would be highly unprofessional, though, as we mentioned, we pay for it, so I don't think Patrick would fire me over it. I did fly from Miami this morning to Appleton, Wisconsin, and I spent 4 hours in the air, and that's all the sleep I've gotten. So if I seem a little less lucid than normal, that's why.
Or more lucid.
More lucid?
Yeah.
All right, but if we start getting into, comparing great players, I've always kind of said, the David Robinson versus Hakeem Olajuwon argument is genuinely a stupid argument. Even though based on, you can go by playoffs or not, but based on the numbers, David Robinson's a superior player. Based on the playoff numbers, Hakeem's a better number, whatever. They were both so great that if you get either one of those players on your team for 10 years in their rookie and prime time, you're good. And it's the same thing with MVP. If you get a player that's above a 0.25, which is 2.5 times better than an average player, you're good. Like there is not a need to basically start getting so much of the minutia. And I say that as a site that does it, but I'm saying that the line we have to just be careful with is making sure that we don't start fighting over stuff that's really hard to notice and instead go for, hey, they're a good player. Yes, that's what I got.
No, exactly. And that's kind of our criticism of Grantland and 538, right, is that they do get way too into the minutia. And, all those great Kirk Goldsberry shot charts that we love and are really interesting maybe don't mean a whole lot in the end. Although they're cool, right? They're very cool. So, no, I agree on the minutia. I've got those four guys up here compared with the comparison tool. And I do agree with you in the end. I think... here's the final question I have for you on this, and we do have Patrick online now, by the way.
Yeah,
so
I say
we can
get
bring
Patrick
him on
on
soon.
the call.
So here's what we'll do. I'll ask you this question. You can go on a little bit, and then we'll get Patrick on. So if you look at Curry versus Harden especially, Curry has outperformed him per minute by quite a bit, but Harden's just played, a ton more minutes, 400 more minutes, which is a lot when you're talking about, 3,000 anyway. So, I guess that's the question is it's, we know that Curry could play a lot more if they weren't winning games so much, but is being able to play more minutes a skill that balances out, being less productive per minute? Because you're not comparing Harden to Curry necessarily. You're comparing Harden to who else would be on the team of the Rockets playing the minutes instead of him, right?
Well, okay, so by the way, this is why the MVP gets hard. And one of the things that bugs me, we've talked about my hatred of interviews a lot. And it's when the exact same signal can mean two contrary things, right? Like if a company likes you, they may not call you back because they're too busy, right? They need to hire someone, but they're so busy, so they don't have time to call anybody. Versus if a company doesn't like you, they just won't talk to you. And so the signal you get is the company not calling you. It could mean two completely contrary things. Now, what you just said, well, Curry gets fewer minutes because he gets rested because his team does so well. So is that a skill? He plays so well so that's a skill. He doesn't have to play as many minutes. He deserves an MVP. Versus James Harden. James Harden's team isn't as good, so he has to play more. That's why he deserves an MVP. I could go either way, and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The end conclusion, by the way, Patrick, is I'm going off on why the MVP award is stupid and it doesn't matter. And
are both of you again talking about giving it to somebody other than Anthony Davis? Because
we haven't even mentioned Davis yet.
No, we haven't. We didn't.
How could he not even be mentioned in the conversation?
It's been a crazy conversation, Patrick. Well, so then, if you want to throw him in there, he was victimized by his injury, right? So that's the only reason he's not being considered as much.
But what does he play? He played like 65 games or something. That's not that crazy.
My only point basically was one MVP for the number of top caliber players in the NBA, especially considering differences of responsibility. I went the Major League Baseball route of they understand giving out the MVP basically to pitchers versus batters and then different conferences and stuff.
That's a really good point. I mean, you could argue that the All NBA spots do that, right? Because you pick the best center, the best power forward, the best small forward, the best shooting guard, and the best point guard.
It gets there, but I mean, well, I guess what my kind of point is, we can accept like there's also defensive player of the year.
Hmm.
I actually don't want to. I have not gotten a lot of sleep, so I kind of just went off on a rant. I was supposed to talk playoffs in the first segment,
I
and I
was
didn't.
just gonna apologize for my own completely disheveled look. I just got out of the rain and it's craziness.
In Seattle, what are the odds? But actually, no. This is good because playoffs. By the way, I'm going to end this. We didn't talk playoffs at all, but I'm going to end the thought with I hate the two different conferences because it sucks that we basically have to decide between Westbrook or Anthony Davis in the playoffs, whereas we could get up to three teams in the East with losing records. I hate the division structure. It doesn't seem to matter, but basically the fact that Portland is guaranteed the fourth seed. With how the home court rules work out, the fourth seed
Yeah.
basically means the fifth seed just gets to steal the fourth seed. So it's not a huge deal, but it might not mean that. I think it's a mess. I think it's silly. But on that note, actually, we're heading into the playoffs. And Patrick, you have been awesome. You've been making my week. This is why I'm so glad you're on the show this week because I want to talk with you last week. The portfolio update.
You're enjoying me squirm as all these teams like have these ridiculous upsets and losses. Like seriously, losing both Memphis at Utah and Dallas at Denver, losing both of those matchups in terms of the portfolio, losing both of those matchups by a combined 2 points was like that's an absurd stroke of bad luck right there. I just
Yeah, I was
really
gonna. Yeah,
upset by
the
that.
the Nuggets. I was like, you can't even do anything. Was it a double or triple overtime with Dallas if they just done their job, just won?
It was a double overtime, yeah, and yeah, just I was and I tuned into both games and like both times when I tuned into the game, it's like the other team was up by like 3 or 4 points with like 40 seconds to go, and I was like sweet, and then they ended up losing those games, and I'm like, oh God,
By the way,
you're
I we're
killing
gonna
me.
we're gonna have to. I kind of love this thing Ian Levy would do a lot, which is like make various fake awards, right? For like player that takes the most contested mid-range shots, or whatever. But like Sacramento deserves some kind of award
Yeah,
because I looked at
oh my
start to
gosh.
not beat the over 30 after that start is just they were
Just
like 9-4 or 9-5 to start the season, and they couldn't pick up
yeah,
21 wins in
yeah.
like over 60 games.
I know. Just totally like right now, if I had to pick the worst teams in the league, the Knicks would obviously be the worst, and then Sacramento would be my number two worst team. I think. I think Sacramento is actually worse than Minnesota. And definitely if you had to pick this is the team I'd like to take over right now as GM, take Minnesota over Sacramento like 8 days a week, right?
Minnesota, you just like hire Phoenix's training staff or something. You just need some
Well,
help.
that and you also like, I mean, it's really not easy to see what are the overvalued contracts you need to jettison there, and you have some decent picks. Although, let's be honest, the fact that this team gave away not one but two first round picks this year in exchange for power forwards that will never amount to anything in that franchise is really rather depressing. It's like the anti Philadelphia. They gave away a first round draft pick to rent Thaddeus Young for 4 months, gave away another first round draft pick on Adrian Payne, who looks terrible and is one of the oldest rookies in the rookie class. It just I don't understand those moves from a team that's rebuilding, right? I mean, you look at the way Philadelphia snapped up guys like Glenn Robinson and and Thomas Robinson. It's like Philadelphia is certainly willing to take flyers on other rookies, but Philadelphia managed to do so without giving up any draft picks or other resources to do it.
Yeah,
Whereas
well, when the
Minnesota is like, well, we kind of like Adrian Payne. Well, why don't we give away a first round draft pick to see
even
if he can
even the
play?
Lakers, they mean, ironically, you just wait for a smart. I put that in quotes. This is again, this is the year that all the smart teams just depress me. But they wait for Houston to give up a solid rookie prospect or a young prospect and pick them up off waivers. It's like there are good players to be had without having to give up a lot, or good upside. That's the word I'm looking for. There are
Sure.
players
Yeah,
with good
absolutely.
upside to be
Right.
had for cheap.
Absolutely. And what I don't know continually amazed me is that I mean uh, the roster churn in Minnesota. I don't know if people have looked at it because often You look Philadelphia, I think, had 25 or 26 different players suit up. But Philadelphia was doing a very deliberate, like, hey, let's sign these players and see if they can play. And if they don't, fuck them. Let's drop them and then let's sign somebody else and see if they can play. Whereas Minnesota, I think they've gone to 23 or 24 players, but a lot of the roster churn was just completely unnecessary. It's like, oh, let's drop Jeff Adrian, who can sort of play, and then let's give a 10-day contract to some European guy who's going to play a total of 5 minutes in those 10 days. And then let's drop him. And then now let's sign, a point guard that we're also not really going to use. It's like they just kind of all season long they just kept dropping players and signing players when it was like, why? Why did you do this? Why didn't you just like why don't you just have 14 roster spots and then you use your 15th for a rotating like evaluation spot? And then eventually at the end of the year, it's like, oh, we're going to drop Glenn Robinson 3. We never actually let him play more than 5 minutes, and we actually have no idea if he can play, but we're just going to drop him even though we paid him a guaranteed contract. So Philadelphia's like, thank you, and snaps him up, and well, let's see if he can play. Let's spend like almost no money to see if this guy can play. I mean, literally everything Flip Saunders is doing is the anti-Philadelphia, and we can argue about
Which is ironic, and you just said Glenn Robbins. I didn't realize that. So that it's even the point is like when you see the two moves happen like simultaneously, you're like Minnesota's dropping this guy, Philadelphia picks him up. You're just like, oh yeah, they are like they are literally opposite because if one does something, the other team.
yeah.
And you could see that. Like I could see the exact opposite happening next year. Philadelphia trading a player that we're complaining and saying, clearly he's overrated and not going to amount to much. And then we'll see Philadelphia trade them to Minnesota for a second round pick.
I mean, right now, I think I think Flip Saunders gets my award for like sort of the most random GM who just doesn't seem to really have any plan behind any of the moves he's making, and he sort of changes his mind every week about what he wants to do. And I can almost guarantee if they don't get the number one overall pick, I can almost guarantee they will draft for need instead of taking the best player available. Like if the best player available is, a point guard, they won't draft him because they're like, well, we already have Ricky Rubio. Um, which makes no sense given Rubio's injury history and given the fact that your team sucks. Like, just take the best player available. Somehow it's all going to work out over the long run, right?
Everybody should take Frank Kaminsky. That's my advice. Even I don't even know anything beyond watching him play in 2 games. But I think I could get a job as a scout for Minnesota now. Because I saw this kid play and he's good. So
He's winning 3-1 in your poll, by the way, Dre.
yeah,
3-1 over what?
the unathletic BS
yeah.
white person. Oh my God.
He's a beast, according to 93 of our commentators.
We didn't even comment on last week's poll, but yeah, basically I said one of the most athletic things you can do is be tall because there is like no other single attribute. I'm sticking by it. There's like no other attribute that gives you like
I don't think that's anyone's definition of athletic.
What I'm saying, okay, so hear me out, and I said this on last week's show. No offense if you didn't listen. I said if you are 7 feet tall in the United States in the right age range, there is like an 11% chance you are in the NBA right now.
I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying that doesn't necessarily measure athleticism.
And I'm saying other people can use whatever, like this. You know us, we do the advanced stats and all that.
Yeah, but okay.
There is
no
other.
Oh, hang on.
Okay.
So I think what we're doing is we're talking about two different things because you and I both agree that athleticism isn't the deciding factor on whether a 7 foot tall player is a great and talented basketball player, right? I mean, obviously, we've talked about this. There's multiple facets of athleticism. You could talk about, Kevin Love has great hands. Larry Bird had great hands. There's all those factors. But then there's also the factor that how many times has any of us who play like sort of middling level rec ball, like you can go into a gym and you can like get onto a random rec league and no one on your rec team is going to yell at you because you're clueless. No one's going to be like, oh, I hate that guy, I don't want him on my team. If you're like that level of talent, how many of you have thought to yourself, well, if I was 7 feet tall, I'd be like an MVP? Because I have skills. I can handle the ball. I can shoot the ball. I have decent post-up moves, but I'm only 5'11", so that doesn't really get me anything. But if I was 7 feet tall with my current level of athleticism, I'd be like, a top 10 NBA player. How many people say that all the time? And honestly, is it true? Like, if you took, an average level high school athlete, somebody who's a varsity level basketball player, and you put him in a set, you put that level of athleticism in a 7 foot body, you genuinely do have an NBA player. Because if you look back in the history of the NBA, there's a ton of 7 foot guys that have played in the NBA who did not have that like varsity level athleticism. You think Darko Milicic, if you think he was 6'2", could he have played varsity basketball? Hell no. I mean, so
Well, actually,
if you're seven
I'm
feet
going to give
tall,
us a tangent to get us back on track on that note, which is interesting. Do you know one of the greatest players in NBA history and an interesting story of him? Tim Duncan actually was not a basketball player until high school. He was
Mhm.
actually a
I
diver
did know that.
first,
I did know that.
and then they were like, "Did you know you're really tall?" And he went and played basketball and has
Was
been
it?
one of the best.
I'm pretty sure Hakeem Olajuwon also did not play until he was like 17 or
Are
so.
you kidding? I'm gonna have to look that up,
Pretty
but
sure he
that's
was like, I think he was a soccer player
Yeah,
in
I think he was a goalie.
and
and Steve Nash actually.
and
Steve Nash has the
Dikembe
soccer team.
Mutombo also did not play until he was pretty old as well. I think he was like 16, 17, 18 years old too, and he was also like a soccer player. Like guys that tall, if I'm sorry, but if you're 7 feet tall, in order to be a dominant basketball player, all you need is a sort of baseline level of athleticism, right? Because let's be honest, your skill, the things that people are going to ask you to do in a basketball game, do not like you don't have to win a foot race against Chris Paul or Steve Nash to be an effective 7 footer. You don't have to be able to jump higher than Andrew Wiggins if you're 7 foot tall with a long reach. They just aren't the skill sets that you're needed. All you have to be is, average or above average level amongst guys who are like in that 6'10" to 7 foot range, and you will be a good NBA basketball player. And I think it should be painfully obvious to anybody watching the game that Kaminsky fulfills that like level of athleticism, right? I mean, there's
Well, he
plenty of
also, I mean, if you look at like I brought this up last week on the show, like I got to see a ton of commercials where he's just standing in the middle of the court and holding up basketballs and go big or go home or whatever the NCAA slogan that they don't pay him to use for is. Um, and I got to like look at his arms and like you can look at say Kevin Durant for instance, and you're like, he looks pretty. I know he's tall, but he looks kind of skinny, and maybe he should bulk up. You look at Kaminsky, it's like, nah, he's filled out. He's got big arms. Like his only unathletic quality is that he's white. I'm sorry, and he's got like a weird beard. I'll give you that. He's white and has a weird beard, and apparently that's enough to ignore his arms, ignore his legs, ignore his 7 feet. That's enough to make him unathletic. So. Anyway, yeah, I did want to say there is the saving grace, which I thought this was going to be the year. I think you'd had 2 years in a row where you basically said, I love the Spurs, but their over-under is like 55. I can't bet on the Spurs. And this year you bet on the Spurs winning the division, and it looked like it was going to fail. And they may actually be what puts you in the black for the year.
Might be. It'll all depend on Wednesday's game and a combination of a bunch of other games.
Are
It's one
you
of the more
sure you're right
complicated.
on this? I read that and you
No, I am
said,
not
don't
sure.
yell at you.
I'm not sure I'm right. Well, so I do know this. I do know that if Memphis loses one and the Spurs win their last game, then I do know I win, right? Because no other. If Memphis loses one, they're the only other team that can get 56 wins in that conference. So that's a given. Like if Memphis loses one and the Spurs win, then the Spurs will take that division, right?
Yep.
I mean, do we agree here on this?
Yes, that one.
What I don't know happens is if between the Spurs, the Rockets, and the Grizzlies, if they all win all of their remaining games, it's a three-way tie, and I don't know what happens then.
Yeah, that was because what you basically mentioned is Memphis, I think, has the tiebreaker against San Antonio. San Antonio has the tiebreaker against Houston. But if
Yes.
all three tie, is it like Houston has the tiebreaker against Memphis? I don't know.
I honestly don't know. Because it's weird because the actually, are you sure about that? Because the Rockets are 8-8 in the division, and the Spurs and Memphis, assuming Memphis were to win out, would both be
Actually,
9-7 in the division.
those wins, the wins that the Spurs had against the Rocket may have changed the tiebreaker scenario, because I do know before when the Rockets and the Spurs were tied, the Rockets would be above them on NBA.com. But
Right.
I forgot, as you're pointing out, because the first question is like, who's better in the division? They've beaten the Rockets twice, and because of that, that gives them two more division wins. So you could be right now that they
But and
just
that
have.
don't they aren't they the winner in the head-to-head matchup
They're the
between?
winner in the head-to-head.
Well,
Oh
so
yeah,
I
and so
think
that,
that's the thing is I don't know who's the head-to-head winner. So I'm pretty sure if it's just Memphis and San Antonio tied in first place, then Memphis has the tiebreaker. Pretty sure about that. I'm
okay.
also very sure that if the Rockets and San Antonio are alone at the top, then San Antonio has a tiebreaker. What I'm not sure about, but I feel like I read somewhere, is that if there's a three-way tie, for reasons I don't quite understand, then the Spurs win the three-way tie.
Actually, this is interesting. Memphis has a tie against the Spurs in terms of head-to-head matchups. So I don't
Yeah,
know
but
what division.
Memphis has the better conference record.
Oh,
So
okay.
if they're both 9-7 in the division, they are tied head to head, and then Memphis has a better conference record,
So
which
a
is I
quote
think.
from Mavs Moneyball here on SB Nation. If the three-team tiebreaker detail above doesn't happen, the Spurs' chances for the number 2 seed are hinged on Memphis losing twice.
But
So,
that was before. That was before the
oh,
game
I
against
already
the
got past it.
Clippers.
Okay, let's see.
The game against the Clippers, in which they lost, was one of those two losses.
If it's a three-team tie between the Grizzlies, Spurs, and Rockets, the tiebreaker is head-to-head among those three teams, and San Antonio has the edge, going 5-3 against those two teams, while Memphis is 4-4 and Houston's 3-5.
Oh, okay. So they do some weird. They
No, it's
throw them
because
on a bucket.
it's because of how the Memphis. It's because of how Memphis fared against the Rockets and Spurs fared against the. So the Spurs don't have a losing record against any of them, I don't think. So they're basically, if you take all those what is it, 8 games between the three of them, then the Spurs have the best record.
So
So
I
that's
want
I
to
think
ask.
that's why, yeah.
So and by the way, I'm going to tell you two things, Patrick. As I mentioned, I'm like beat. So I'm actually. I know we normally go late, but I'm actually going to let myself. I'm giving myself the hard cutoff. So like
Yeah.
in 5 minutes, I'll throw out my shout outs. If you want to keep talking, I have absolutely no complaints beyond that. But what
No,
I
I
actually
think
want
I
to
have
ask you.
Indian food coming.
Oh, I'm jealous, man. I wanted to, so I'm actually gonna cheat and just give one of my shout outs early. So you get the shout out. John Floyd 6675 had a fantastic response to you when you put, I think, your first mini portfolio update. He just said, get a Vanguard account. The great follow-up he gave though was also I broke my wrist and I'm on painkillers, but the advice is still good. I thought that was hilarious. And
That is really good advice. Yes.
as all of us mentioned, as we have discovered, all of the geeks on the show, we all max our Vanguard account each year. Good job, good financial advice.
Sorry, I
I
maxed
think
our
that,
401k. No,
yeah,
nobody is saying you can't put more money in your Vanguard account if you want to beyond your 401k, obviously.
yeah, exactly. Well, I do SEP, but yeah, same notion. But so what I was going to say is, obviously, even just breaking even, this pays for itself, and I think you're up overall on your bets. But you've done this 3 years in a row. What are kind of just general thoughts on preseason bets in the NBA? And obviously things like Phoenix just screwed you, right? Phoenix, you didn't really engage me much, but I
So
tweeted out at
yeah,
one.
yeah. What's interesting about Phoenix is it wasn't the Dragic trade that screwed me. The Dragic trade was whatever.
It did
They
hurt you
they
though.
it hurt me a little bit, but what really hurt me was the whole, well, let's just give away Isaiah Thomas and Miles Plumlee for Brandon Knight. That's what really hurt me. That is the trade that really screwed me because I thought even after Dragic was gone, I was like, okay, we'll be fine. Isaiah Thomas will play a few more minutes, and Thomas has been pretty good this year, so he'll cover up the production at the point guard, and we'll be okay. And then they gave away Isaiah Thomas as well, and I'm like, fuck me. That really hurt, and it also hurt that they just. And I also thought, okay, now that Miles Plumlee's gone, we're definitely going to see 30 minutes of Brendan Wright every night, right? Because like, no, we're not going to see that. We're just going to see more Alex Len, and he's okay, and we're going to see more of the Morris twins playing small ball at the power forward position, and it's like, can somebody please just get Brandon Wright in a fucking game to win me a game here? Um, it those were the events that sort of cost me, and in general, I thought this like post All-Star break period was, if you're like a Phoenix Suns fan, from a franchise perspective, it was disastrous. They gave away a great Lakers pick, which is probably going to be like a top 5 pick next year. Um, They gave away Isaiah Thomas, who was an efficient player on a cheap contract, and they gave away Miles Plumlee, who was also another efficient player on a cheap contract, and they acquired a guy that they're probably going to spend 12 million a year on next year, who isn't that good at the point guard position and doesn't seem to want to play the shooting guard position when you've already got Eric Bledsoe. It's just like I can't. It's hard for me to think of a player who's kind of a worse fit for Phoenix than Brandon Knight. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, and I
I mean,
mean,
it's
I guess just one of the things, because you notice I get kind of pessimistic at the start of the season, where it's just like basketball is the most of, if you look at all the sports, it's the most essentially predictable sport. It's kind of funny in basketball where, barring a few really crazy things, and they've happened rarely. They've happened enough to not call them impossible. Like, they're not black. I wouldn't even call them black swans, but like, pretty much, if you don't have a star player on your team to start the season, you're probably not going to the finals. Now, there are a few players that have like the upside. Like, you could potentially look at like Whiteside and Gobert and say, you got a shot. Like, if you get a team around them, maybe. But then that's knowing who busts out. So I'm not even calling that perfect. But even being as predictable as is, do you think that Vegas just has a pretty decent hedging mechanism? Because that's the interesting I'm noticing is like, do you think we as a group have had like an interesting streak, or if there's a different model? Because basically you're up, but I don't think even by your volition, and maybe I'm wrong, I don't think the last 3 years you've crushed it in Vegas. Or what are your
no. I
thoughts?
mean, I think the return is around 10%, which is obviously not big. But I will say a couple things. One is that the arbitrage opportunities each year are limited because if there isn't a big roster change, then Vegas already has like the line very close because if you take any random team, look at their performance in the previous year, and assuming there aren't any big roster changes, you just assume they're going to have exactly the same performance this year. That's going to be an extremely good predictor of success in the NBA because, as you say, things are pretty stable in the NBA. Performance is pretty stable in the NBA. So, barring injuries or a player who had an outlier year the year before and dropping off a cliff or vice versa, you know, it's kind of like what happens with, I'm going to say, 20 out of the 30 teams is there aren't big roster turnovers, so last year's pretty much equals this year. Where it gets different is young teams and how they improve. It's kind of hard to figure out. Teams with big roster overhauls, I think there's spots where Vegas gets everything wrong there. So last year, the classic example was the New York Knicks, where they had a pretty big roster change where Jason Kidd left
Tyson Chandler.
Tyson Chandler left.
Not
No,
preseason
Tyson
though.
Chandler was still there.
Yeah.
So, but
Oh, you're right. You're right.
before that, they acquired Andrea Bargnani and they lost, who's terrible, and they lost Jason Kidd and Steve Novak, who was also a very good producer the year before, right? So they took like a good role player and replaced him with a terrible starter. Um, and then they also lost like by far their best win producer in Jason Kidd from the year before. But it was kind of like nobody noticed because Kidd was scored 9 points a game or something, so nobody thought of him as the big win producer. So it was right there. You could see like, okay, that's 10 to 15 wins out the door, and yet Vegas has their number even higher than they had than it was the year before, and it was like it was honestly like the best arbitrage opportunity ever. And we joked a lot about mortgaging your house to bet the under on the Knicks, and and there just aren't a lot of situations like that where that kind of a big shakeup gives you an arbitrage opportunity, and then often in those arbitrage opportunities, you still have a ton of variance. So another example, which I think was in the same year as the Knicks, was the Minnesota Timberwolves. We bet the over on them, and then Kevin Love had knuckle push-ups, and then and
Rubio and Vucevic, right? Just both couldn't stay on the court.
Pekovic, you mean?
Pekovic, sorry, yeah. I get
Yeah.
those two confused.
Or well, actually, it was. Uh, yeah. So last year we bet the over on them, but it was a tight over. The year before that, which was actually the year, not the Knicks year, but the year before that was when they had Andrei Kirilenko and everything. That was the year where Kevin Love missed the entire year, pretty much. Last year we had the over on them, and that was the year where Rubio didn't play enough. Um, or Rubio got hurt like in the third week or something like that. Was it
I don't
third?
remember. I
Third?
mean, yeah, I don't remember all the woes of the Wolves, which
Yeah,
is, there's so
it
many
was
at this point that
bad.
kind of run together.
Yeah. And then I mean, you have events this year like what happened to the Suns or what happened to Sacramento, which I mean, those are very big outliers with a lot of variance. So basically, I think the edge is kind of small, and there's going to be a lot of variance. I wouldn't really be confident about our models until 10 years have passed at least to
And yeah, and I mean,
to
like I said,
say. And I keep saying this over and over and over and over again to anybody who will listen, but Vegas does not set the over line at the spot where they think the team, like if Vegas thinks a team is going to win 45 games, they don't just pin the over under at 45 and never move it. Vegas moves the over under line to keep pretty much the same amount of bets on each side of the line. So if a team is extremely popular and everyone wants to bet the over, they will move the over higher so that they get more people betting the under. So the number that Vegas is giving you is not necessarily Vegas's prediction of how that team is going to finish. It's where Vegas thinks I'm going to have half my money on both sides of this line. So there's opportunities there for arbitrage as well. And
well,
it
one thing
depends
that
on
sucks,
where
what
they
sucks
are.
for me is I went out to Vegas during March Madness and they actually tightened up their odds. So the two bets I was going to make is I was going to make a bet on Houston to win the finals and Atlanta to win the finals, and I thought they would both be around 10-1. And because it was March Madness, Vegas basically said, we got a ton of people here. We got a ton of action. We're just going to cut the odds in half. So we're going to put the Hawks at 5-1. We're going to put the Rockets at 4-1. And I was like, I'm not going to take those
Well,
bets.
no, but what was really happening there is there were tons of people like you who thought, "Wow, 10
Exactly.
is great. I'm going to bet on that." And Vegas said, "Well, no, we don't want everyone on this side of the line, so we're going to move it down to make the over less attractive, or to make that bet less attractive." And that's just how Vegas moves lines all the time. And like for a great example of that was how the line for Atlanta moved in the preseason. Like when we were lining up our spreadsheets, I think Atlanta was like 11 or 12-1 to win the Atlantic. And then like the week I was going to Vegas, it was down to 8-1. And then by the time I got to Vegas, it was 6-1. And it's like there were lots of other people that saw that line and thought that's a great line.
Oh,
Um,
funny. I saw an article today that said how Atlanta built a winning team and no one saw it coming. I thought that was a fun one.
well, I mean, we obviously thought Atlanta was a good team. We had them in that 44 to 40 to 48 sort of range, which is where we had, Washington and also Miami. So we all looked at it like, look, this is a three-way tie. Therefore, the fair bet on each of these guys to win the division should be 2 or 3-1. And so when you see anything that's higher than that, you say, well, that's a good bet. I don't think I don't think anyone can realistically say, "Oh, we saw 60 wins."
Well,
Like
also
that's crazy.
Corver. If you could call Corver's season, I mean, he was a good player, but to predict like he did the Steve Nash trick, like if you predict a player in their mid 30s is going to have the best season of their career, like
Yeah.
people should legitimately look at you like you're crazy.
Yeah, it's Corver, it's Jeff Teague improving, it's Dennis Schroeder going from abysmally horrible to pretty good, competent backup point guard. Like there's a pretty big parlay of things that had to improve. However, I will say, maintain. I think it was very anyone who really understands basketball, could have totally seen like a 40 plus win season coming, because of Al Horford coming back and being efficient once he gets healthy, and that generally being a decent team anyway. I mean, they were. I felt like they're going to be in the thick of it between those three teams in the Atlantic, because the Atlantic just isn't sorry, not the Atlantic, the Southeast just isn't a very strong division. So 6-1, like if you'd given me 6-1 on the Wizards, I'd have taken that too, right? It felt like a three-way tie there, or a three-way toss-up. So we would have bet any team there of those three that had like better odds than 2 or 3-1. So that was like kind of one of those sane bets that sort of worked out. And it's
Although
another
Dre,
example of where
you
there's high
did predict
variance.
that Kyle Korver had a better season than Klay Thompson in the preseason, though, so you were right about that about
Well, I
Korver.
mean, if you even
Barely.
just look at if you look at my quote unquote outlandish claims, like I'm gonna watch DeAndre Jordan next season be like the worst player in the league. I don't know it's not going to be injury. Like DeAndre Jordan's just going to fall off a cliff next year, and I'm not going to know why
Like,
because the
well, like
rules.
Lance Stevenson this year, like what the hell? Like,
Yeah, but I'm just saying I've learned enough too where like to your point on variance, and this is just variance in sports in general. If you make two or three picks, sports has enough variance where it's easy enough for just two of those to fall through for reasons you couldn't have seen coming, or even reasons that if you thought were coming, like you just thought were unlikely. You're like, well,
sure.
we said that about Clay. We're like, well, if Clay does start taking the right shots, he could, I'm dripping with the
Yeah,
sarcasm I
no,
had back at the time.
yeah, it's like what happened to us last year with the Pacers, where we said we took the under on the Pacers, which was 55, I think. And there were a bunch of Pacers fans riding our ass about how we were crazy. And like the number of things, the parlay of things that all happened to come together to make that bet like a bad bet. And then it turns out they fell off a cliff just like kind of like it turned out they won 56, I think, right? So we weren't really that far off. And that was despite the fact that they had that ridiculous start where I think they started 33
Yeah,
and
I had
something
something up there
absurd.
that basically said they looked like the Warriors do now. Like they were in the thick of teams with a win-loss percentage, like the Warriors are now. Okay, like I said, I would actually love to keep talking, but I'd also love to go to sleep and let you get your Indian food. So I'm going to let you end with your favorite bet, preseason bet. Doesn't even have to come true. Your least favorite preseason bet, and then we'll go into shoutouts.
My favorite bet was actually the Hawks to win the division. I loved that bet, like just 6-1 on that, and I thought they were, the best. They were in a three-way tie for best team in that division. Um, my second favorite bet was actually the Minnesota over, which I'm just I'm never gonna
Charlie
bet on
Brown,
this
man, you
fucking
are
team
Charlie
again. I
Brown.
know. It just because I mean, come on, I still can't believe like the
Even
crazy
by the
injury.
even
Like
if it's $10, you have no choice but to bet the over on Minnesota next year. Even if
yeah,
it's the
because well,
smallest
I'm
amount of
screwed. No matter what I do, if I decide not to bet on them because they fuck me so often, it's going to be like they're going to win like 45 games and crush the over and screw me. Andrew Wiggins is going to be like Dwayne Wade reincarnated. Uh, and if I do bet it, it's that it's Andrew Wiggins will be Dwayne Wade reincarnated, but he'll get injured in the third week or something absurd like that is going to happen. It's just yeah, that
Zach
was
LaVine had a 30-point game recently, I believe, Patrick, against the Warriors.
yeah. My least favorite bet, actually, going into the season, my least favorite bet was Sacramento, and I wish I had listened to my instincts there. Um, just because I didn't, I mean, I could kind of see why we had these predictions, but I didn't trust Rudy Gay. I didn't trust DeMarcus Cousins. They didn't turn out to be the reason it's been such a bad bet, but I still wish I hadn't put much money on them. Yeah, not a good bet.
To be fair, like even from the outside, this is one of those where, they picked up Vivek Ranadiv, got that big push from Malcolm Gladwell. I mean, obviously, I don't really buy it. That was an article I wrote 2 years ago. They picked up Dean Oliver in the offseason. So you're like, okay, you're actually going to embrace the stats. They picked up George Karl. My actual thought was, I was like, George Karl's problem isn't so much good offenses. The Denver Nuggets actually had some of the best, most efficient offenses in terms of taking good shots. The issue was he just put the wrong players on the floor. And I said, well, it's pretty obvious who you have to put on the floor with this team. So I was like, things look like they're going well and nothing panned out. So I think that one's
Yeah,
rough. I just,
yeah,
they hate you.
yeah. It was very rough. That yeah, and I think my favorite my early favorite for best bet next year is going to be the Jazz over, but there's a question in terms of whether or not Vegas and the crowd at large has also figured this out. The overline might be too high. I mean, I could see the overline being at something like 45 where it's just a little too high, but if the Jazz over is at like 35, I'm going to be just all over that like a rabid dog next year.
I love that one.
Yeah.
All right, so shout out time. Mine are actually, it's an easy 1, 2, 3. I already gave away one, which was on the Vanguard account. But I was in Miami for travel last week. I got to see a really good show. I got to see Hannibal Buress and Dave Chappelle, which was awesome. Hannibal Buress has a lot of good sports jokes, which is funny. One of his recommendations is An easy way to make soccer better is do the pinball trick, throw two balls into the mix and make the field half as long, which I think would make soccer a much better game. But so yeah, Hannibal Buress and Dave Chappelle, amazing. I was actually front row center for Hannibal Buress, and he jumped off the stage. I flinched, so I hope I didn't offend him. But there was that, and then actually a cool part about it was Bomani Jones introduced Dave Chappelle,
Oh.
and Dave Chappelle did Donald Sterling jokes. So I was like, this is the most bizarre. I was like, Bomani Jones just introduced Dave Chappelle, and Dave Chappelle is making jokes about Donald Sterling. I was like, what is going on in my life right now? But that was cool, and those are my three shout outs.
I actually don't really have any shout outs this week. I'm very unprepared. It's been a crazy busy week for me at work. So I'm just going to give a shout out to Kawhi Leonard, who's like pulling some MVP stuff to bring back my Spurs bet from the dead. Like it literally, and also I have a bet with a friend. I bet before the season started, he agreed to give me 55 and a half on the Spurs instead of 57. So I was all over that bet. And of course, it looked for a while like that was also hopeless. And now, if the Spurs win that one, I get a nice fancy steak dinner from my friend who was foolish enough to bet against the Spurs. So, man, I'm all about Kawhi Leonard right now.
He's been amazing.
Yeah.
Anything out of you, Brian?
Oh, sure, I've got one. Earlier you mentioned the Black Swan effect recently, and that reminded me that as I'm showing right now, Autobahn.org has a black flamingo photo on their website right now, so go check that out. Very interesting.
I I'm way too tired to understand the connection.
It's literally a black flamingo. It's Autobahn.
I guess. All right. So anyway, if you found the show without the site, we are at boxscoregeeks.com. You can find the show on iTunes and Stitcher as The Boxscore Geek Show. Make sure to follow. I'm going to list us as how they're showing up in my Skype thing. Brian Foster on Twitter as Boxscore Brian, Patrick Minton as NBA Geek, and myself as @NerdNumbers. And with that, we will see you next week.